In the spring of 1940, the German war machine rolled across Western Europe with a speed that shocked the entire world. And within just 6 weeks, France had fallen to an army that seemed completely unstoppable. Panzer divisions crushed everything in their path, Luftwaffe bombers darkened the skies, and the word blitzkrieg entered the vocabulary of every nation, watching in horror. Nazi propaganda showed an unstoppable force of steel and fire, mechanized columns stretching to the horizon, a military juggernaut that could conquer anything it set its sights on. What the propaganda didn't show was the one weakness that would eventually bring all of it crashing down. And that weakness was hiding in plain sight the entire time. Germany was running out of oil. By the final weeks of the war, the mightiest army in Europe had tanks sitting empty in defensive positions because there was no fuel to move them. Army trucks that once carried supplies across continents were being towed by oxen. Aircraft sat grounded on airfields while enemy bombers flew overhead unopposed. The story of how Nazi Germany went from conquering a continent to watching its war machine grind to a halt is one of the most important and most overlooked chapters of World War II. Before a single shot was fired, Germany's oil problem was already severe, and the numbers tell a story that wartime propaganda worked hard to hide. In 1938, Germany consumed approximately 44 million barrels of oil, which sounds substantial until you compare it to what other major powers were using. Great Britain consumed 76 million barrels that same year. The Soviet Union burned through 183 million barrels. The United States, even before entering the war, was consuming a staggering 1 billion barrels annually. And that would only widen as the conflict progressed. Coal remained the backbone of German energy, providing 90% of the nation's power consumption. But coal couldn't power tanks, and coal couldn't fuel aircraft. The German military was building a war machine that ran on oil, and that oil had to come from somewhere. If you're finding this useful, take a second to subscribe, because what comes next explains exactly how Germany tried to solve this impossible problem. German strategists understood their vulnerability, and they developed 3 primary methods for securing the fuel their military would need. The first was straightforward imports of crude oil from abroad, with Romanian oil fields at Ploiești representing the single most important source. The second was domestic oil field production, which remained frustratingly limited no matter how much effort was invested. The third option was the one that German engineers believed could save them, and it involved turning the one resource Germany had in abundance into the fuel they desperately needed. Synthetic fuel production from coal became the centerpiece of German energy strategy. The science behind it dated back to 1925, when 2 German chemists named Franz Fischer and Hans Tropsch developed a process that seemed almost miraculous. Under the Fischer-Tropsch method, coal was compressed into gas, then mixed with hydrogen through specialized contact ovens, while specific catalysts were added to the mixture. The result was the formation of hydrocarbon molecules that could be further processed into usable fuel, primarily diesel oil. A more advanced technique known as the hydrogenation process allowed the direct conversion of coal into gasoline, exactly what the Wehrmacht's vehicles required. The logic was compelling. Germany possessed enormous coal reserves, some of the largest in Europe, and if those reserves could be transformed into liquid fuel, the nations might achieve something close to energy independence. Hitler's regime embraced this vision wholeheartedly, viewing synthetic fuel not just as a practical solution, but as proof of German technological superiority. What nobody fully accounted for was how much time, steel, and industrial capacity the synthetic fuel program would actually require. The urgency behind synthetic fuel development grew directly from Germany's historical experiences. And those experiences left deep scars on the national psyche. During World War I, the British naval blockade had exposed just how dependent Germany was on imported raw materials, creating shortages that contributed to eventual defeat and the subsequent economic collapse. After the war ended, Germany faced chronic shortages of foreign exchange currency needed to purchase oil from abroad, making imports increasingly difficult even during peacetime. There were also broader concerns about global oil reserves during the 1920s and 1930s, with some experts predicting that the world's proven oil deposits might be exhausted within decades. Those fears turned out to be wrong, but at the time, they seemed legitimate, and they added another layer of motivation for developing alternative fuel sources. Hitler's ideology demanded that Germany achieve complete independence from foreign powers, particularly when it came to strategic resources like fuel. Self-sufficiency wasn't just an economic goal, it was a matter of national pride, and according to Nazi thinking, racial survival. In August of 1936, as the strains of rearmament began showing cracks in the German economy, Hitler issued what became known as the Four-Year Plan Memorandum. This directive gave Hermann Göring sweeping authority over economics, defense, and agriculture, with a clear mandate to prepare Germany for war within 4 years. The dual mission was explicit, and it shaped everything that followed. Germany needed to rearm as rapidly as possible, and Germany needed to become self-sufficient in fuel production before any major conflict began. The clock was ticking, and the synthetic fuel program became the centerpiece of that desperate race against time. Progress came, but it came slowly, and it never quite matched the ambitious targets that planners had set. By 1937, hydrogenation plants scattered across central Germany were producing 4.8 million barrels of various petroleum fuels annually, a meaningful contribution, but still far short of what the military would need for sustained operations. Building synthetic fuel plants required steel in quantities that the existing economy simply couldn't provide, and that steel was competing with demands from tank production, aircraft manufacturing, naval construction, and countless other military priorities. Manpower shortages added another constraint, as skilled workers were needed everywhere at once. At the outbreak of war in September 1939, only 7 synthetic fuel plants were fully operational. 3 more were in advanced stages of construction, and 2 had barely broken ground. Even with frantic efforts to accelerate construction, progress fell behind projections month after month. Despite these setbacks, output did grow substantially over the following years. Synthetic fuel production climbed from 10 million barrels in 1938 to 36 million barrels by 1943, representing a more than 3-fold increase. The proportion of synthetic fuels in Germany's overall supply rose from 22% to over 50% during the same period, meaning that by 1943, more than half of all German fuel came from coal-based production rather than natural petroleum. That achievement represented genuine industrial capability, and it kept the war machine running far longer than it otherwise could have. But here's the thing that rarely gets mentioned. Germany's coal industry was genuinely world-class, and it provided the foundation that made synthetic fuel production possible in the first place. Coal supplied 90% of the nation's energy consumption, powering factories, heating homes, and driving the industrial processes that kept the economy functioning. German mines were among the most mechanized in Europe by 1937, with productivity figures that outpaced competitors by significant margins. Output per man-hour exceeded Great Britain's by roughly a third and doubled the figures achieved in France and Belgium. coal abundance gave German planners reason for optimism. The raw material existed in vast quantities, and the technology to convert it into usable fuel had been proven. What they underestimated was the sheer scale required to fuel a military fighting across multiple continents simultaneously, and the vulnerability of centralized industrial facilities to enemy attack. The situation was about to get much more complicated, and the catalyst came from an unexpected direction. In August of 1939, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union seemed to create stability in Eastern Europe, with both powers agreeing to non-aggression and secretly dividing territories between them. For a brief moment, it appeared that Hitler had secured his eastern flank, freeing Germany to focus on Western Europe without worrying about a two-front war. That illusion didn't last long. The catalyst for rupture came when Stalin's forces occupied northern Romania, moving uncomfortably close to the oil fields at Ploiești that Germany depended on for a substantial portion of its imported fuel. Hitler viewed this as an existential threat, and his reaction shaped the entire trajectory of the war from that point forward. Hitler's thinking became crystal clear in his communications with Mussolini, where he stated bluntly that the life of the Axis depended on controlling those oil fields. The Caucasus region became the ultimate strategic prize, and Operation Barbarossa was designed with that prize firmly in mind. The invasion of the Soviet Union wasn't merely ideological conquest or territorial expansion. It was also a desperate grab for the oil resources that Germany needed to sustain its war effort over the long term. The initial phases of Blitzkrieg had worked brilliantly in part because advancing German forces could capture enemy fuel supplies, sometimes seizing stocks that exceeded their own consumption during the campaign. Poland fell so quickly that logistics barely became a factor. France collapsed before supply lines stretched to their breaking point. The system worked when wars ended fast. The eastward offensive into the Soviet Union revealed the fatal flaw in this approach. Supply lines stretched across hundreds of kilometers of hostile territory, vulnerable to partisan attacks, and hampered by infrastructure that couldn't support the volume of traffic required. A critical complication emerged from the difference in fuel types used by opposing forces. German panzers ran on gasoline, while Soviet tanks operated on diesel, meaning captured fuel was often useless for German vehicles. Every drop of gasoline had to travel from Germany or synthetic plants deep in the rear, across roads that turned to mud in autumn rains, and froze solid in the brutal Russian winter. The Battle of Stalingrad in 1942-43 marked Germany's first catastrophic defeat in Europe, and fuel shortages contributed directly to the disaster. Estimates suggest that the 20 armored divisions participating in Operation Barbarossa required approximately 450,000 barrels of fuel, and that figure only accounted for the tanks themselves, motorized infantry, support vehicles, the Luftwaffe, the Kriegsmarine, artillery tractors, and the entire truck logistics network also demanded constant fuel supplies. The numbers simply didn't add up, and the consequences played out on frozen battlefields where vehicles sat immobilized for lack of gasoline. And what happened next revealed a truth that German propaganda had worked very hard to conceal. The image of the Wehrmacht as a fully mechanized modern army was largely a myth, and the reality was far more primitive than wartime films and photographs suggested. Up to 70% of German military transport during World War II depended on horses rather than motorized vehicles. This reliance on animal transport wasn't a temporary measure or a backup plan. It was built into the structure of the German military from the beginning, reflecting both the limitations of industrial capacity and the understanding that fuel supplies would never be sufficient to fully motorize the army. Horses didn't need gasoline, they could eat local forage, and they could traverse roads that would swallow wheeled vehicles whole. The trade-off was speed and the vulnerability of animals to the same brutal conditions that affected human soldiers. The disconnect between propaganda imagery and battlefield reality created dangerous misconceptions, both among German leadership and among the Allied forces trying to understand their enemy. Films showed endless columns of tanks and trucks rolling across conquered territory. They didn't show the thousands of horses pulling wagons behind those armored spearheads, or the desperate scramble for fuel that occurred every time an offensive stalled. In North Africa, this fuel crisis reached its most acute form, and one commander's private correspondence revealed just how desperate the situation had become. The desperation for fuel led to creative solutions that bordered on theatrical deception. Workshops in Tripoli fabricated dummy tanks using lightweight materials mounted on fuel-efficient Volkswagen chassis. These decoys presented a false image of greater armored strength to British reconnaissance, stretching limited resources further by making the enemy believe Rommel had more tanks than actually existed. It was ingenious, and it was also a sign of just how dire the supply situation had become. In the desert, fuel became more precious than gold. Every gallon was fought over, every drop carefully rationed, and every convoy that made it through enemy interdiction represented a minor miracle. The North Africa campaign ultimately failed for multiple reasons, but the inability to sustain adequate fuel supplies ranked among the most significant. Rommel's Africa Corps was ground down not just by British resistance, but by an enemy that couldn't be outmaneuvered or outfought. The simple mathematics of supply and demand. The situation on all fronts was about to get catastrophically worse. German logistics followed a predictable pattern through the middle years of the war. Winter months allowed the accumulation of fuel reserves as military operations slowed and consumption dropped. Summer offensives then burned through those reserves at alarming rates, depleting stockpiles that had taken months to build. This cycle repeated year after year, with each summer's consumption slightly exceeding what could be replaced during the following winter. The summer of 1944 broke that cycle permanently. Between May and September, a coordinated Allied bombing campaign targeted German synthetic fuel production with devastating effectiveness. The attacks reduced output by approximately 85%, transforming what had been a manageable shortage into an absolute crisis. May 12, 1944, stands as one of the most consequential dates in the air war over Europe. More than 900 Allied bombers struck synthetic fuel plants in a single coordinated assault, leaving approximately half of the targeted facilities damaged or destroyed. Albert Speer, the Reich Minister of Armaments, later acknowledged that the technological war was effectively decided on that day. The infrastructure that Germany had spent years building to achieve fuel independence was being systematically dismantled from the air. By September 1944, German synthetic fuel production had collapsed to approximately 5,000 barrels per day. The paradox of 1944 is almost impossible to comprehend without understanding the fuel crisis at its core. German industrial production reached its absolute peak that year, with factories turning out tanks, aircraft, and weapons in greater numbers than ever before. Yet those factories couldn't operate at anything close to capacity because there wasn't enough fuel to power them. Tanks rolled off assembly lines and sat waiting for gasoline that never arrived. Aircraft were completed and remained grounded on airfields for lack of aviation fuel. Negative feedback loops accelerated the collapse. Without fuel, factories couldn't operate efficiently. Without efficient factory operation, fewer replacement parts and maintenance supplies reached the front. Without proper maintenance, vehicles broke down at higher rates. without fuel to power recovery vehicles, broken down tanks, couldn't be retrieved and repaired. Each problem intensified every other problem, creating a spiral that no amount of industrial ingenuity could reverse. Air operations became virtually impossible as aviation fuel stocks dwindled toward nothing. Pilot training programs were cut back dramatically because there wasn't enough fuel to keep new pilots flying. Even experienced pilots found themselves grounded, watching helplessly as Allied bombers flew overhead with near impunity. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of European skies, became increasingly irrelevant to the outcome of battles it could no longer meaningfully contest. On the ground, the situation was equally dire. Divisions that had once swept across continents now sat immobilized in defensive positions, their vehicles empty, their mobility reduced to whatever soldiers could carry on their backs or drag with horses. The final weeks of the war produced images that would have seemed unthinkable just years earlier. German army trucks, the backbone of logistical support for one of history's most feared militaries, were reduced to being towed by oxen through the rubble of collapsing Germany. The symbolism was impossible to miss. A modern, mechanized army regressing to methods that predated the Industrial Revolution, not by choice, but by absolute necessity. During the Battle of Berlin in April 1945, many of the remaining armored vehicles stationed around the capital couldn't be deployed to defend the city. Tanks sat in fortified positions with empty fuel tanks, while Soviet forces closed in from every direction. The resources existed on paper. The crews were ready to fight, but without fuel, the most powerful weapons were reduced to expensive bunkers. Hitler continued issuing orders from his bunker, directing divisions to counterattack and reinforcements to move, apparently unaware or unwilling to accept that his commands couldn't be followed because the vehicles to execute them sat immobilized for lack of gasoline. Operation Spring, awakening in early 1945, represented Germany's final major offensive, a desperate attempt to secure oil fields in Hungary that might provide some relief from the crushing fuel shortage. Despite using elite forces, including the 6th Panzer Army, the offensive failed, and within weeks, the surviving soldiers were prisoners, not to the Soviets, but to the Americans, as the Reich collapsed from every direction simultaneously. The war ended with Germany's industrial might intact on paper, but completely paralyzed in practice. In the aftermath of Germany's surrender, two figures who had shaped the Allied victory offered perspectives that cut to the heart of what had actually decided the conflict. Stalin, whose Red Army had absorbed the worst of German military power and ground it down over 4 years of brutal fighting, emphasized the material factors above all else. The war, he stated, was decided by engines and octane. Machines required fuel, and the side with more fuel could keep more machines running. The disparity in fuel resources between the opposing sides was staggering. By 1943, the United States alone was producing approximately 4 million barrels of oil per day, compared to Germany's desperate scramble to reach even a fraction of that output. American fuel was also higher quality, with 100-octane gasoline providing better engine performance compared to the 87-octane gasoline that German forces had to use. Every aspect of the fuel equation favored the Allies, from quantity to quality to security of supply. Germany entered the war with structural deficiencies in oil resources that no amount of tactical brilliance could overcome. The synthetic fuel program achieved genuine technological success, but it started too late and never reached the scale required to sustain military operations across multiple continents simultaneously. When Allied bombing destroyed that infrastructure and Soviet advances cut off Romanian oil, the German war machine was left to slowly starve. Historical narratives often emphasize overextension, the Russian winter, and fighting a two-front war as the primary causes of German defeat. All of those factors mattered. But underneath them all ran a simpler truth that every German commander understood intimately by 1944. You cannot fight a modern war without oil, and Germany never had enough oil to fight the war it started. If this changed how you understand World War II, subscribe now, because there are plenty more untold stories like this one waiting to be explored